Hello, I'm James Preston and welcome to another edition of Executive Corner Expert Talks. In this episode, I'll be shining a light on Cynata Therapeutics, a clinical stage stem cell and regenerative medicine company engaged in the development of disruptive regenerative medicine products. To talk through the finer points, I'm joined by Managing Director and CEO of Cynata Therapeutics, Ross Macdonald. Ross, thanks for joining Kalkine.
Thanks, James. Good to be here.
Ross, great to have you here. First and foremost, for those who aren't familiar with Cynata, what exactly is it that the company does?
Well, we are developing a proprietary platform technology for the manufacture of a cell therapy medicine using mesenchymal stem cells, or MSCs. And MSCs are probably the most interesting cell therapy that's being developed at the moment around the world. And our platform enables the consistent and robust manufacture of these very, very exciting therapeutic products.
Yeah, it should be a very exciting phase moving forward for your company. You're obviously doing some great work. Now, regenerative medicine is obviously a core focus for the company. And with 2021 coming to a close, how did Cynata fare in terms of its clinical development plans?
Well, we've made great progress in the past 12 months, James, with the advancement of 2 clinical trials that are currently underway with our MSC-based therapies. The first is a phase 3 clinical trial, so that's a late-stage clinical study in osteoarthritis, one of the largest commercial opportunities in pharmaceutical land at the moment, a disease that many would be familiar with, a disease that represents a major medical challenge because it's a progressive degenerative disease. It doesn't get better. There's no cure at the moment, and current standard of care essentially is analgesics, to relieve the pain of that sore knee or sore hip that many of the audience would be aware of. And then ultimately, however, this is like writing a check. Basically, at some point, sure, you get the goods that you're paying for with the check, but sooner or later, you've got to come up with the money. And unfortunately, with osteoarthritis, it's a progressive condition, and pain relief really does nothing. Our therapy, we anticipate, will alter the outcome of this disease to finally prevent the deterioration of the joint or even enhance the recovery. Hence, the area that you described as regenerative medicine. So that trial is underway in Sydney and in Melbourne. It's substantially funded by NHMRC, that's the Australian Government Medical Research Granting Body. So shareholders have a fabulous leverage on this particular indication. And we expect that study to report sometime around late 2024. A very large study, 440 patients, but again, substantially funded off our balance sheet. Then the second trial that we've made progress on in the past year has been in respiratory distress. And that's a medical condition that probably needs no introduction, given it's been on the headlines for the past year and a half, with patients who have COVID-19 progressing to serious complications, mostly revolving around respiratory distress. That's basically, patient can't breathe properly anymore. It's like they're suffocating. And our MSCs in preclinical studies have shown great promise in addressing that condition. So that trial also is underway now. We had expected that to wrap up perhaps by the end of this year, but it's going to be line ball probably a little later than that. But that's always the challenge with clinical trials. You can't anticipate exactly when you're going to finish, and that will report certainly in next year sometime.
You mentioned there the osteoarthritis issue. The process of dealing with that in terms of regenerative medicine, how does it look? Are you able to go into much detail about what your technology does to try and, I suppose, reverse the issue that is occurring in these patients?
Well, primarily what occurs is this vicious cycle of inflammation around an initial joint injury, which could be a sporting injury or just overuse, for instance, that then accelerates. And unfortunately, the body's repair and regenerative processes constitute an extremely fine balance between degeneration or destruction and regeneration or repair. And when everything's in balance, that's fine. But unfortunately, in osteoarthritis, there's a shift in that balance away from regeneration or repair to degeneration and destruction. And pain relief, that is taking, an aspirin or a paracetamol tablet, won't really do anything for that imbalance between the two. It just masks the pain that's occurring in the inflamed joint. MSCs, on the other hand, have a profound effect on the inflammatory process by regulating it or calming it down. The aim being to shift the balance back again in favour of at least the status quo or perhaps even regeneration. And of course, in younger patients, regeneration occurs all the time. A child that fractures their leg, for instance, recovers very, very quickly. When grandma falls down the stairs and breaks her leg, though, it's a completely different situation. And that's because as we age, that shift in the balance between regeneration and degeneration obviously veers towards the degenerative pathway. So it is our expectation, based on the observations made so far, that our MSC treatment in these osteoarthritis patients will ultimately result in a reduction in this inflammatory process and ideally some step towards halting it completely, allowing recovery of the joint to some extent, or joint function, and 10 or so good years out of the joint before the patient ultimately has to go for a joint replacement. And of course, we all know that that's the end game for an arthritic hip or an arthritic knee eventually, assuming the patient lives long enough, of course, and needs that sort of surgery. But certainly an MSC therapy, as our trial is studying at the moment, could completely alter the outcome in these patients.
And Ross, as part of the trial, what's the average age of these participants? Are they people who are later on in life and are suffering sort of natural osteoarthritis, or do you also have younger people who have potentially had a few knee reconstructions, for example, and are finding debilitating effects from repeated injuries?
Yeah, it's a cross spectrum of patients. Obviously, in any clinical study, you want to ensure that you've got as much real life representation as possible amongst your patient population. Early trials tend to restrict the variability among patients to some extent, so that at least you get a consistent outcome, either consistently no result or a consistent good result. And then as you move towards a phase 3, for instance, you're looking at a much more real life representation. So yes, we're seeing sort of the more elderly person who has been frustrated with the slow degeneration of their knee, and also younger patients as well who perhaps have an exacerbation of arthritis initiated from a sports injury, perhaps.
Well, let's move on a little bit here. I was wondering if you could shed some light on the critical shortcoming in existing methods of production of MSCs that the company is actually addressing through its Cymerus technology.
Yes, and look, reduced to its simplest form, success in the pharmaceutical industry relies on 3 pillars. And when I say success, that is commercial success, the ultimate outcome for investors who have put their hard-earned into companies like Cynata. That is safety, ensuring that the product is safe and doesn't cause serious side effects. The second is, of course, efficacy, showing that the product is effective in treating the disease for which that product is indicated, and having a good outcome. But the third point that many people tend to forget when the excitement is all around whether the product works or not is an ability to manufacture the product economically. And for most typical drugs that we'd all be familiar with, like, for example, antibiotics or drugs that lower blood pressure, manufacture is relatively straightforward. But for cell therapy products, where we're dealing with a living drug, manufacture is substantially more complex. And because it's a living drug, and because it's a human cell that we're using here, we have to start somewhere with a donor. And the traditional or conventional approaches to manufacturing MSC-based therapies requires lots and lots of donors, because these cells are very scarce in the body, And those donors are being prepared to donate, for example, their bone marrow, which is a surgical procedure, or adipose, that is fat tissue, from which the MSCs can ultimately be isolated. And the major challenge that is faced there, let alone the fact that not everyone wants to be a bone marrow donor or a fat tissue donor, is that every donor is different. And thus, if you start with cells from donor X, they're very different from cells from donor Y. Even though they're still MSCs, they still do have slightly different properties, enough that creates a question mark of consistency from batch to batch. Our technology, on the other hand, one of the leading platforms in the world for the manufacture of cell therapies, ensures that we have a highly consistent product. We don't rely on going back to donors again and again and recruiting donors who are prepared to donate their bone marrow. And bear in mind, that's not a trivial process. It's not like donating blood, which most of us do without question. But donating bone marrow requires a knitting needle-sized surgical device going into the top of the hip and the bone marrow being sucked out. So you can imagine that that's not something that people will do every day of the week. And that, of course, represents a major logistic challenge to the manufacture of MSC-based therapies. And that logistic challenge is addressed by Cynata's proprietary Cymerus technology, which uses a totally different approach. We start off with one single donor prepared to donate their blood one time, so we never have to go back to that donor again. And that is a fundamental shift and a major competitive advantage for Cynata and our platform technology.
Once again, another very exciting development that you are working on. So kudos for that. It's quite interesting to see that you are taking that slightly different approach compared to other big pharma companies. I just want to change gears a little bit here. Now, you've also recently signed an agreement with Fujifilm. What are the details of that arrangement? Why do you think it'll benefit Cynata, and why the choice of Fujifilm in particular as a partner?
Well, this new relationship that we have with Fujifilm is a great outcome for our shareholders. We've had a long relationship with Fujifilm, and they are very, very committed to the success of Cynata. And that commitment touches a number of different points. And it goes way back to when, just after the company was founded in 2013, when we acquired, through a license transaction, the original starting material that we use in our manufacturing process. And we acquired that from a company called Cellular Dynamics International, CDI. And then subsequent to that, CDI was acquired by Fujifilm. So suddenly we were joined at the hip. But at that stage, Fujifilm was particularly interested in developing therapies in the regenerative medicine space. Because we were the leading company, and still are worldwide in that sector, Fujifilm took a license ultimately to our first product, which is for a condition called graft versus host disease, GVHD. Fuji, however, subsequent to that, we've underwent, I guess, a change in corporate strategy where they started to move more towards becoming a greater investor in manufacturing technologies and contract manufacturing, particularly for cell therapy products, and shifted from being involved in the development of cell-based therapies, sales and marketing of that type of product. At the same time, of course, we were underwent the pandemic last year, which really delayed the development of our product under the license agreement. So eventually we both sort of met in the middle and said, well, look, how about we retain a relationship around manufacturing, but allow Cynata, being a young, nimble, vibrant company, to move forward quickly with the clinical development of the GVHD product, which Fujifilm at that time had a license to. So we couldn't, because they were our exclusive licensee, all of those aspects of the commercial development of the product where it was in their hands. So we got that back. We kept the manufacturing relationship with them. They paid us $5 million, and we now are moving forward very aggressively with our US regulatory strategy to get a clinical trial underway in graft versus host disease next year, which builds on the very solid foundation from our earlier clinical study in that same disease. Meantime, Fujifilm remain very committed to Cynata. We are, after all, using their starting material in our product. So, of course, that's great kudos to them as well, as they see Cynata, the most advanced company in the world in the iPSC space, taking their technology forward into development. It looks good for them. It's great for us. It was a real win-win. They remain a significant shareholder with around 6% of the shares, which are currently escrowed. So their commitment to Cynata, I think, is very, very solid. So, as I said, a great outcome for our shareholders and for the company going forward.
Absolutely. Now, this year as well, you also did a bit of capital raising with Bioscience Managers as one of the cornerstone investors. How far does that cash raising take you?
So we raised 18.3 million, give or take, in December and January, which was cornerstoned, as you mentioned, by Bioscience Managers, one of the most sophisticated healthcare investors globally. And that investment of $10 million, which cornerstoned that raise, was only undertaken by Bioscience after they completed extensive investigation of not only of Cynata's technology, obviously, but the broader MSC space and our investment thesis around a unique manufacturing technology. So they took $10 million in stock at the time, and then we raised a further 8.3 on top of that, and that takes us forward well into 2023.
It sounds like an enormous achievement that you've done so far across the various trials, being able to have, I suppose, the backing of one of these big companies that really does give you that solid foundation to continue doing the excellent work you're doing. Do you take a lot of confidence out of having that kind of capital raising coming in?
Yeah, look, it's always great to have a sophisticated investor provide that level of support. And as I said, only after they've done extensive due diligence. It's a bit different, of course, to just sort of buying a stock on a whim that, you know, you suddenly read about on one of the blog sites, which I might add, I don't look at a heck of a lot. But nonetheless, you know, a sophisticated investor doing their due diligence, understanding the fundamentals of the technology and making a long-term commitment to it is a real, I think, a feather in our cap, and certainly something we're delighted about. I'd also point out that one of our other larger shareholders, Fidelity, did the same thing. They spent a lot of time investigating the merits of the technology, the quality of the company, and the opportunity for a share price uplift in the longer term.
Well, look, we've spoken a lot about what you achieved in 2021, but what do you hope to achieve with Cynata in 2022?
Well, in addition to the 2 clinical trials that are currently underway that I mentioned before, that is the osteoarthritis trial and the respiratory distress or respiratory failure trial that are currently underway, we expect to start very soon a further clinical study. It'll be a phase 1/2 in diabetic foot ulcers, a major unmet medical need, just like the other indications that we're pursuing. That will commence here in Australia at sites in Adelaide. And again, maybe just this side of the new year, but a little bit depends on finalising some of the logistic aspects before that trial starts recruiting patients. But all of the authorizations and ethics approvals and so on are now through. So it's just finalising the last minute details to get that trial underway. And then next year, we plan to commence a phase 2 trial in graft versus host disease. And as I mentioned before, that was the target that we went to first. A trial that we completed a few years ago resulted in a fantastic outcome that was eventually recognised by one of the most prestigious medical journals worldwide called Nature Medicine, when they featured us and our results from that trial on the front cover of their November last year edition. So great recognition there. That trial will get underway sometime next year, and obviously we'll be updating the market from time to time on progress towards that. And obviously getting those rights back from Fujifilm to bring that product forward was a great outcome for us.
And Ross, just before I let you go, any final thoughts you'd like to offer to our viewers and your shareholders?
Well, look, in parallel to our clinical development pathway, and I always say that the data drives value for shareholders. It's generating good quality clinical data that really results in an uplift. And we've just seen today the sort of uplift that shareholders can enjoy on the back of good uplift with neurons result today, where they just reported good results from a clinical trial. That's the sort of solid data that I think is a real value driver. But in parallel to that, the company's got an aggressive corporate partnering program where we engage and are engaged with multiple companies at any one time to investigate the potential opportunities for us to work together, either through license agreements or collaborative product development activities that will also drive value as well.
Well, Ross, really fascinating to find out what Cynata's been up to. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, James. Great to talk to you, and I look forward to updating you and investors over the coming months as our plans progress.
Absolutely. Looking forward to doing the exact same with you. That is Ross Macdonald, the CEO and Managing Director of Cynata Therapeutics. And if you missed any part of that conversation, you can catch the whole interview on our YouTube channel, Kalkine Media. So make sure to subscribe. That's all for now, though. I'm James Preston, reminding you to stay apprised and invest wise with Kalkine.